This month, we've reached the 6-month mark of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the impact of the war is being felt throughout the world, from the food prices to the relationship between Russia and the West. In today's session, we will be talking about how is Europe handling the European crisis. I will start by introducing our speakers who are joining me online. Here with me are Professor Milena Sterio. She is the law professor and Masters of Laws Programs Director at Cleveland Marshall College of Law, and Professor David Campbell. He's an associate professor for comparative political science at the University of Vienna. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Now,
thank you too.
Now, the war in Ukraine has unleashed an existential crisis for the international system and confronted us as a direct challenge to the global security order. We've seen EU countries trying to show solidarity with Ukraine, but on the other hand, the EU's need for oil and gas from Russia prevents them from acting as a full union. The invasion of Ukraine has put the European bloc to the test and posed so many questions on the future of the EU and whether the EU has reached or it perhaps reacted to the invasion properly. So I want to start off with a question. Where's Europe's leadership during the crisis with Russia? And I'm going to start with you, Professor Milena Sterio. What do you think about it?
So where is European leadership? I think in some ways we've seen two different things in parallel here. One is that we've seen some unprecedented and swift responses from the different EU countries in response to the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So we've seen the imposition of sanctions in a very rapid succession, if you will, in an unprecedented way. We've seen assistance being deployed to Ukraine and somewhat of a unanimity on that front from various European leaders. So on the one hand, we've seen unprecedented swift responses and a seeming unanimity. On the other hand, I do think that the crisis in Ukraine is exposing some of the weaknesses, if you will, in the European system. And I don't even know if it's fair to call it a weakness, because I think what this is exposing is the fact that European Union is not one single nation. It is not one single country. It is a bloc. It is a union of 27 different member states that have very different leaders, that have very different economies, that have very different interests, and that have a different level of dependency, if you will, on Russia and a different impact on their own national economy. And so for that reason, I do think that European leaders have had to respond in different ways because many European countries are, or most European countries are democracies, and these leaders also respond to domestic constituencies. They do have to worry about re-election at the domestic level. And so they can't be simply reacting to sort of the needs of the EU for a unanimous response. They also have to be reacting to the domestic needs and their domestic constituencies. So I do think that the leaders are there. I think that they're doing what they can within the constraints of the European system. But I do think that this crisis is exposing this fact that the European Union is not a monolith. It's not one single nation, and instead it's a block of different nations linked together. But these different nations have different needs, different interests, and their leaders have to respond to these domestic concerns.
Professor Campbell, what's your take on this one? Where's the European leadership in this war?
I mean, in a certain sense, the question you raised is, of course, a very complex question, which could be brought in a bigger context. So generally asking, what is the leadership of the European Union in the international arena? And I think this, in a certain sense, represents always a challenge because, as just was said before, the European Union system is a very complex system with its multi-level architecture. So you have the member states and the, so to say, interests of the different national states or the nation states within the European Union. At the same time, of course, you have the supranational architecture of the European Commission, etc. So in that sense, it's always a challenging point to talk about how can the European Union, in that sense, in politically or strategically speaking, in the international arena, so to say, compete or cooperate with other super states like the United States, Russia, or China. However, if you would compare the current crisis of the invasion of the Ukraine by the Putin government in Russia, which was launched February 24th this year, and you compare this crisis with other crises, let's say like the refugee crisis, which in that sense was sparked by the implications of the war in Syria in the mid 2010 years. My impression would be that currently, actually, the European Union is doing better than if you would compare the European Union, so to say, with other crises. And I think also the European Commission, as one of the main supranational institutions of the European Union, actually took here a very bold and straightforward stand rather from the beginning, yes, by basically saying, but this now, so to say, Putin, Russia has crossed a red line. This is not to be accepted, yes, which probably in a certain sense also surprised, I would say, the Putin government. Yes, he thought maybe, as if you look back in 2014, when Putin illegally had annexed the Crimea, a territory of the Ukraine, a sovereign state, yes. I mean, there were some sanctions, so to say, imposed against him, like, so to say, kicking him out of the club of the 7 or 8, as you would call it in international language. But they were rather smooth sanctions, yes. And in a certain sense, the system still wanted to cooperate with the Putin regime economically in terms of energy imports, etc. But so to say, here he had crossed, so to say, really a red line, yes. And so I think, in fact, the Commission of the European Union, in that sense, was here. I mean, this may be one of the few examples that the European Commission really, so to say, has expressed leadership. On the other hand, of course, one must say, as also was said rightly before, that different member states with different interests. Yes, and I think in a certain sense, maybe one could distinguish between 3 groups within the European Union. So the ones having a tougher stand on Russia would be the Baltic states, would be Poland, would be other states in a closer proximity, let's say like Finland or the Czech Republic, yes, who basically very much from the beginning had emphasized to say, well, this is a no-go, this cannot be accepted. Then we have some of the bigger states like France, Germany, Italy, maybe also Austria, sort of a little bit in between. So it took them some time in that sense to really be convinced about sanctions or how far to go with the sanctions. And then you have somehow the, so to say, the softies, let's say like Hungary under Viktor Orban, who are very reluctant in that sense at all, so to say, to go into these sanctions. Yes, and then, as was said rightly before, there are elections. Yes, now in the context of the French elections, I think, which you had parliamentary elections and presidential elections in France this spring, there, so to say, the Ukraine war had actually played against, so to say, the right-wing populists. Yes, I think in a certain sense they were embarrassed because they had posted election brochures where you could see, so to say, the front runner of the major right-wing populist party in France in a picture together with Putin. Yes. Now, of course, if you look at opinion polls and so to say, the inflations are soaring up. Yes, the next winter is coming. The energy bills are very expensive. Yes, in a certain sense. I mean, I just looked at the last opinion poll in Austria, and as was said about Germany. So the voters, or the electoral base, somehow becomes somewhat fragmented. Maybe something like into 2 halves. So on the one hand, the one half saying maybe we have gone too far. Yes, who can afford an inflation like this? And the other saying, well, the sanctions, there's no alternative. They're necessary. Maybe we even should go further. Yes. So this will be very delicate, and we're going to see how this may play out, so to say, now in the upcoming Italian parliamentary election, which is being set for this September. But even there, so to say, the 3 parties of the center-right, right-wing wings of that political spectrum, but it appears somehow that now they are somehow divided on whether or not, so to say, Italy should continue these tough sanctions against Putin, Russia, or not. Yes, so I would say it's a big and broader picture. But somehow, maybe I would say a little bit at the elite level, I think there's more and more a growing consensus. There is no alternative against these sanctions. And I even would go so far to lean forward by basically saying these sanctions have not come to go. These sanctions have come to stay in a certain sense, as long as this Putin government is behaving the way
we will
it is.
definitely touch upon the topic. of the sanctions, but also there's something Professor Milena
Mhm.
she mentioned about the shortcomings. But I really want to dive deep into this. So what exactly shortcomings of the European Union were revealed during the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Should we start with Professor Milena again or Professor Campbell?
Please, with Professor Milena, yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. So that's a very interesting question. As I said earlier, on the one level, the crisis, the response, the European response to the crisis in Ukraine has been pretty unified and unprecedented, right? Because European countries, European leaders were able to unanimously come to the decision to impose sanctions 6 or 7 different times. So that requires unanimity. That obviously requires consensus. And in another pretty remarkable, turn of events, if you will, the EU decided to use the so-called European Peace Facility, which is a fund for military and defense support for third countries and coalitions, to finance delivery of lethal equipment to Ukraine in a major foreign policy shift prompted by the war. That also required consensus and unanimity. So those are not shortcomings. Actually, those would be examples of this very unanimous response by the EU. But then if you want to talk about shortcomings, I would really say that the shortcomings really imply more of a long-term strategy of the European Union. Because Professor Campbell just mentioned, for example, the sanctions that are here to stay. But you do have to wonder what is the goal of these sanctions, and really, is it realistic to expect them to stay indefinitely? And if not, then the European Union has to have some kind of a strategy to end the war, if you will. The point of the sanctions is to weaken the Putin regime, but the ultimate goal has to be to basically end the war, to get Russia to basically get out of Ukraine or to get the parties to the negotiating table. And I'm not really sure that the EU has a long-term, peace negotiating strategy in place. So that could be a shortcoming. And same thing when it comes to the delivery of these lethal weapons to Ukraine, that obviously has serious implications, and it has serious implications regarding the use of military force by the EU. What if Russia were to respond militarily against an EU country, right? The EU would then have to have a unified military response, and the EU doesn't really have a military. Yes, there's NATO that works in parallel, can work in parallel with the EU, but the EU and NATO are not the same thing. And so I think if you want to talk about shortcomings, I would talk about these more sort of long-term goals of peace and justice that I'm not sure European leaders have necessarily, they've thought of it, but I don't think they have the long-term solutions yet. And then I would mention, and maybe we have time to come back to this also, the other issue, I think, and perhaps this is not a shortcoming, but is definitely an important issue, is basically the possible enlargement of the EU. Ukraine has requested to become a member of the EU, so have Moldova and Georgia, so have different countries in the Balkans, Bosnia and Serbia and Montenegro and Albania and all of these countries. And so I do think that there's this issue of possible EU enlargement or expansion that the crisis has, again, put to the forefront of all these European issues. And I do think that that's sort of a shortcoming, because I think we're seeing this tension of the current EU member states not being super willing to accept new members, right? And we've seen these sort of endless accession talks or, preliminaries to accession talks, and no actual concrete processes in place, no actual solution. So I do think that that's a shortcoming, the possible, issue related to the enlargement of the EU.
It's a very interesting question, and I also want to know, Professor Campbell, you can reply to this briefly. We heard that many countries now want to join the European Union. They want to pass this a very complicated process of joining the European Union. But also, what do you think? How might Russia react if Ukraine actually joins the EU?
Mm-hmm. If I may, so to say, pick up, and I would like, I want to touch on your question, but maybe, so to say, maybe add 2 or 3 thoughts, so to say, to the analysis before. The one thought experiment, of course, we could raise, and again, this is only a thought experiment, is, why has Putin decided decided to invade the Ukraine February 24th in the year 2022 is, why has he not invaded Ukraine February 24th in the year 2000, so to say, when at that time, so to say, we had an American US president called Donald Trump. Now, the thing is with Trump, he always has a little bit this unpredictability is, I do not know how he would have reacted, maybe even harsher than Biden. But in that sense, there's somehow this long-term or mid-term, let's say, rivalry, even perhaps at a personal level, which was set between, the Obama and his administration against Putin. We know when Hillary Clinton ran against Donald Trump, it was said, so to say, Russian, so to say, cyber technology, etc., were used basically to circulate, so to say, private conversations of Hillary Clinton, and so on. And in a certain sense, it was predictable that Biden, so to say, is not somebody who would like Putin a lot. In that sense, also Russia was one of the last nations basically acknowledging that Biden has won, so to say, the last, so to say, U.S. elections. Yes. So this, I think, is a little bit a mystery. Perhaps, so to say, the military buildup of Putin was not ready back in 2020, or Putin thought Trump is going to win anyway. Now, the implications, of course, is now with the Biden administration, this has referred back to a revival of NATO structures. Yes? And I would say in terms of realpolitik, current defense structures of the European Union without NATO membership are not sufficient. Yes? So the NATO in that sense is basically the bridge linking together in that sense the primarily the US and North America, so to say, with Europe, not of course only the European Union, as an example, Great Britain, United Kingdom, and Turkey, they're also members of NATO. But in that sense, I think in a certain sense, it verifies that at least in the current context, European defense system outside of NATO probably would not work. And there are, of course, many reasons. Some are obvious reasons in the sense of well, what is being invested into military structures and capacity, and so on and so on. Mm-hmm. And then again, we have this complex structure within, so to say, the European Union. Yes, I mean, would, so to say, other European Union member countries accept something like a lead of the French or the Germans within the European Union? I do not know. In that sense, so to say, the Americans always can play a little bit the role of the neutral, so to say, leader, dominant force. So I think it would be completely unrealistic to expect that in the near future, at least in the foreseeable times, a European defense system would work, so to say, outside of NATO against, so to say, a power which is as it is, so to say, in the context. In the context of Putin. Yes? So these, I think, are somehow so to say, settings which must be kept together. Now, concerning, so to say, what would membership of Ukraine to the European Union change in the interaction of so to say, Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, how does Russia actually react to it?
Well, I think, I mean, in a certain sense, on that issue, I think probably Putin can lay back, so to say, in his armchair, because, of course, on the one hand, we know that to become a full member of the European Union, this is, of course, an enduring process. I mean, criteria have to be met, etc., etc. So I do not know, in that sense, if Ukraine could become, so to say, a fast, sort of fast lane ticket, so to say, a member of the European Union. And in a certain sense, probably I would say Putin would, in a certain sense, ignore this justice. He would say, well, if Ukraine is a member of the European Union or not, for me, and so to say, my strategic objectives, this is, so to say, of no concern. Yes. Of course, if Ukraine would formally become NATO member, this, I would say, would be an issue to which, of course, he would react as. And in that sense, could use it as a pretext, basically, maybe trying to upscale, so to say, his military and invasion efforts. Yes? But I don't think that the NATO is prepared, so to say, is prepared, so to say, for a membership of Ukraine. I mean, this is a theoretical possibility. And at the same time, I'm also not really sure if NATO membership really was, so to say, a major motive for Putin to invade Ukraine. Yes, I think in a certain sense this is basically overestimated. There has been, in that sense, I mean, on the one hand, if you go back in the biography of Putin, I mean, he was somehow a KGB member, yes, who had worked in former Eastern Germany. He basically saw the collapse, so to say, of the Soviet Empire. Maybe he thought Gorbachev is much too loose, so he's basically a loser. He would, so to say, do it differently if he would have a chance. And then there was an article release, yes, which was read by some members, let's say, of the international academic community, but not by too many. There was a publication release signed by Putin. I don't know if he has written this, which was basically issued, I think, about a year ago, or not much longer than a year ago, where he basically argued that actually the Russians and Ukrainians are anyway the same, so to say, the same nations. Yes, I mean, if you read, I don't know who's written this paper. Maybe he had a ghostwriter or not. I do not know, but it was signed by his name, and basically he argues in a way that actually the Ukraine is something like a false identity. It's actually the Ukrainians are, in a certain sense, Russians who do not know that they're Russians. Yes, but of course, you cannot justify an invasion based on such a theoretical piece of work. Yes, but I always would think, if we want to look into the mindset of politicians, particularly if they become very autocratic or even worse later on, do not make the mistake not to read what they've written, or at least what they've authored. I mean, there are many examples of the interwar period. I mean, going back to Germany, where so people had said, well,
I apologize, but I have
why
to.
should we read this?
Yeah,
sure.
Because we have so many topics to touch upon, but I really want to hear the comments from Professor Sterio about the situation. So how, like, Russia might react if if Ukraine joins the EU. What's your take on this one?
Sure. So I do agree with Professor Campbell that in some ways, even if Russia became a member of the EU, I don't think that it would change anything in the conflict currently. Now that the conflict has already begun, if Ukraine were to join the EU tomorrow, I don't think that would necessarily change things. As you might know, as some of our listeners might know, the EU, even though there is a common defense policy strategy that the EU has, it doesn't have the same level of mutual defense obligations that, for example, the NATO treaty does. So if Ukraine joined NATO, that would have serious implications, because then that would obligate all other NATO countries to react militarily. But
the famous Article 5 and
exactly. The so-called, some people refer to it as the Three Musketeers provision, one for all for one for all. The EU doesn't have anything, that's of the same magnitude. And so that's why EU membership wouldn't necessarily, sort of directly change things. However, if I may, just for a quick second, I know you have many other topics to talk about. Some of these paradigm shifts that have occurred within the EU in response to the Ukraine crisis include, for example, a new so-called strategic compass that the EU leaders adopted back in March of this year. And this document, which is really part strategy, part an action plan, provides for a shared threat analysis and sort of greater direction for the EU security and defense activities through 2030, with the view of Russia as a threat in mind. And so one of the ideas discussed in this document, in this policy and strategy document, is, for example, the idea to develop a 5,000 soldier rapid deployment capacity troop, if you will, with contributions from various member states, which would be different from what exists today, because today you only have different member states that have their own armies and militaries. This would be a common 5,000 soldier unit under EU command that could arguably respond, right? That could arguably engage in the battlefield. So if something like that were to actually become part of EU law and policy, then your Ukrainian membership in the EU would mean something more. Presently, I don't think that there are any sort of direct implications, at least not at the sort of security, defense, military level.
Okay. So we've seen at the start of the invasion, Russian invasion of Ukraine, that there was a tremendous amount of solidarity amongst the member countries, and we've seen that, especially when it comes about refugees, welcoming them in respective countries. So, do you think are these solidarity mechanisms of the European Union in the field of defense and migration are they sufficient enough, Professor Milena Sterio?
Sure. Let me start with migration because we already talked a little bit about defense. So, when it
Mhm.
comes to migration, we've seen definitely a heightened willingness on behalf of various EU countries to take in Ukrainian refugees. And I have to compare this to the Syrian refugee and migration crisis, where the response was not the same, where other than, Turkey that took in millions of Syrian refugees and migrants and Germany that took a significant number, most other EU countries were not so willing to say, come here and stay here. So here, in response to the Ukrainian crisis, we've seen a number of states basically indicate their willingness to take in a number of refugees and migrants. Now, as all of you know, if a Ukrainian refugee or migrant enters, let's say, Germany and lives there, they can be, because basically there are no real borders anymore within the EU. That person can very easily travel to France or to Austria or to Italy or to Spain and Portugal, and also go there and live there. So, in some ways, because of this freedom of movement that we have within the EU, this issue of migration um, is perhaps a little bit different than if we were dealing with, let's say, somebody who goes to Canada and wants to enter the United States, where that is not so easily possible. But at the same time, I would say that the crisis in Ukraine, I think, has exposed, if you want to go back to this theme of shortcomings,
Mhm.
I don't think that there is a unique common European migration strategy or policy. So it's basically up to the different governments of different countries to decide how many refugees or migrants they want to officially, take in and resettle. So, in the context of the Syrian crisis, there were actually tensions within the EU, with Germany saying, "Wait a second, we took in 500,000, and you, France, you only took in, a handful, or you, Italy, you only took in a handful." So, I do think that there's a little bit of a tension there, in the sense that there isn't necessarily a common migration policy that the EU has. But so far, we've seen a willingness on behalf of most EU countries to say we'll at least take in some of these Ukrainian refugees and migrants.
But we've seen the scheme that's been in place, introduced by the European Union, basically allowing Ukrainian refugees to reside and live in the EU for up to 3 years. And do you think, Professor Campbell, that actually that scheme is working and it's working in the benefits of the refugees?
Well, I mean, as was just said before, and here I more or less completely agree. You just can see that the Ukrainian refugees are being treated very differently now within the European Union member countries if you compare this, let's say, with refugees coming from Syria or the Middle East. Yes, so there is something like a certain Eurocentric, perspective. It's not being officially said, but I think this is partially, at least you could project it somehow, part of the public sentiment by saying Ukrainians are Europeans, they're culturally more similar. So in that sense, even countries who normally are very restrictive about refugees, like in Hungary, they would not kick out Ukrainian refugees. Yes. In a certain sense, now, does the European Union really have a supranational migration policy? Factually said, probably not. I mean, the European Commission, in that sense, can work out certain recommendations. They would want to have a supranational, let's say, migration and policy and how to basically treat refugees. But here, the different member states have the final say, and there's a huge, so to say, divergence. Now, however, here again, with the refugees from Ukraine, there somehow was basically now a coordination mechanism where the supranational European Commission with the member states basically has cooperated to a far degree. And I think, so to say, as one example, basically the situation is in Austria, and I would assume this is rather similar to other countries. So if you come in as a refugee from the Ukraine, you're registered as a refugee. Basically, you can access the labor market, so to say, from the beginning. Yes, there
Yeah,
may
and
be
it's really
some
important to mention that you
technical,
don't have to claim asylum in those
technical.
countries.
Yes. So basically, I mean, there may be so some technical smaller barriers in the sense that maybe the administration doesn't always function as good as it should be, but basically the free access to the labor market. This is not the case with, so to say, a normal refugee. So even if his, so to say, status basically as a refugee is cleared, then the question is basically, well, is he being granted, so to say, the final status as an asylum seeker, etc. So it's just also here you see basically how differences are being made between refugees coming in from the Ukraine and other countries. Another typical example would be Poland. Poland was always very strict on allowing in refugees, but at the same time, Poland was very welcoming, so to say, to this massive influx of refugees from Ukraine. And probably Poland is also the country number one through which basically the major move of Ukrainian refugees is moving into the European Union. Yes, so the differences, so to say, are obvious. And
Yeah.
politicians also say if they're more, so to say, permissive with regard to the Ukrainians in Austrian daily politics, they say this has no implication to the general policy on how to deal with refugees.
So, do you think that it's going to have ramifications on the future refugee crisis? Because obviously, we're going to see more scenarios like this. Do you think the European Union might react differently if another refugee crisis occurs on its land, on its soil? Professor Campbell?
Well, yes. Well, the quick response from my side would be it would depend from which country the refugees are coming. Yes. So if this would be a country culturally more similar to the average European Union member countries, we can maybe also expect, so to say, a form of welcoming as it is now. If they're being perceived in these public narratives as being culturally more different or further away than not. Yes, I think this, so to say, would be the type of hypothesis I would project. Let's say if we would have a refugee crisis from Belarus, yes, the Belarus regime is, I don't know, collapsing, terrible things are happening, civil war and so on. Maybe refugees from Belarus could expect some type of welcoming comparable to the one we just can witness in the case of the Ukraine.
But why is that the case, Professor Milena? Why is the case that we have two different reactions to the same issue?
Well, I hate, I hate to be cynical. I think Professor Campbell was basically, leading up to this. But what we've seen so far is that, European countries seem more willing to take in larger number of refugees and migrants if those refugees and migrants essentially look like them, act like them, are of a similar sort of ethnicity, faith, religion, and can sort of be assimilated in an easier manner. That seems to be the sort of, perhaps cynical, but I think realistic response here. And so I do have to agree with Professor Campbell that it seems to me that in light of what we've seen, if you compare the response to Syria and the response to Ukraine, it does seem to me that European countries would be willing to accept refugees and migrants and sort of act similarly if those refugees and migrants were coming from a European-like nation versus if they were coming from somewhere far away, where there's at least this perception that it's going to be more difficult to integrate them and assimilate them into mainstream society. And unfortunately, we have seen these far-right political groups gain leverage and power in different countries, in France, in Hungary, in Poland, right, where part of their rhetoric is this anti-immigrant, people who look differently from us sentiment. And so that is just part of, I think, the European reality. And I think that goes to my earlier point about European leaders. When they think of developing common EU policies, the fact that they have to respond to their internal democratic constituencies as well. And so a politician who's thinking of re-election has to think about, okay, if I accept, thousands of migrants or refugees from a country like Syria, how is that going to impact my chances of re-election domestically, politically? I think that's just the reality.
All right, let's focus on Russian oil and gas now. Last month we've seen the EU adopted a plan to cut consumption of gas by 15% and reduce their dependence on Russian supplies. Of course, Hungary voted against it, saying it's unenforceable. So, what do you think? Is the EU able to cope without Russia's oil and gas, Professor Sterio?
So that's really the $1 million question. And one of the interesting things that we've seen is that when it comes to, for example, the EU sanctions that were imposed against Russia over these multiple rounds of sanctions, we see that the gas sector hasn't been sanctioned in the same way that other sanctions have. As you mentioned, as of March 2020, EU leaders agreed to phase out the EU's dependency on Russian fossil fuel imports. And at this special meeting of the European Council in May of this year, leaders reviewed progress on strengthening EU's energy independence, and they called for things such as a diversification of energy supply sources, a faster deployment of renewables, and an improved interconnection of energy networks. And they also talked about an international coordination to ensure a more comprehensive global response to energy and other food security challenges. So we're seeing a response from European leaders that's calling for essentially independence from Russian energy sources, but those are all longer term goals. It's not so easy to say, we should not be dependent on Russian gas or oil, and as of next Monday, that's going to be the case. It takes a lot of time to build up that lack of dependency to become energy independent. And so I think the answer is that in the short term, I don't think that all European countries can be totally independent of Russian imports. I think it's much more difficult than that. I think in the long term, the Ukraine crisis has prompted European leaders to develop a strategy, a better energy strategy, if you will, to think about energy independence in the long term. But I think in the short term, it's going to be very, very difficult.
Professor Campbell, what's your take on this one?
Well, it's obvious, so to say, technically difficult to become on a fast ticket, so to say, independent from Russian fossil energy. But again, there is, so to say, no alternative. Yes. Because Putin, he always now would weaponize, so to say, these types of energy, yes, and to take a picture. So he reminds me basically, the old Caesar in the Roman arena, and he would say, yes, you can live, no, you're going to die. And this is basically the game Putin is going to play every week. Yes. So today I'm going to deliver natural gas. Today, well, I don't know. Tomorrow, no, there's a problem with the engine and so on. So basically, this is not anymore a reliable source of energy supply. Yes. And I would say basically, I'm so to say, I understand. So in the short run, in particular, not this fall and this winter, this can be a very difficult time. We do not know how much of the natural gas Putin is going to deliver. This is basically, because this is something which can change, like a fast of something like that. Where today it's going to be delivered next week, not and so on. But I would say basically in everything beyond the 1 year, 1.5 year perspective, I think it's absolutely clear that in that sense Europe must move, so to say, out of this dependency from Russian natural gas, particularly. Yes, I don't think it's a problem with petroleum. Concerning coal anyway, basically, an embargo is being set in place. And in that sense, maybe it also, because the point is always, is there anything positive which, so to say, can be drawn from this whole terrible, and it is a very terrible situation in that sense, if you have a war which is being unleashed, of course, against all of these people and the misery and the pain and the killing and so on. I think it makes, so to say, obvious why this ecological transition is that essential. And I would say the big problem is that actually back in 2014, when Putin had annexed the Crimean Peninsula, okay, this would have been the good time basically of saying, well, there must be a long-term strategy to become more independent. The opposite has happened. Europe has become, in fact, more dependent on Russian fossil energy since we have Nord Stream 2, which would have been approved if it wouldn't have been because of the invasion on February 2022. And I think a lot of this talking about, the decarbonization of energy and the ecological crisis and so on was partially lip service. Yes, it was a little bit this, we should call it like this. It was the greed of the West. It was the greed of Europe for cheap fossil energies coming from Russia. Yes. And still, if you listen to some of the politicians or representatives of some, I don't know, chambers of commerce and so on, you think they're crying the crocodile, so to say, so to say, uh, um, teardrops. Yes, basically. Well, now we lost, so to say, this fine, cheap, so to say, Russian natural gas, and what has it financed in our economic cycles and so on. Is so it just makes clear, so to say, that this ecological transition now is not only because of ecological reasons necessary, but also it is the way of becoming independent from Russian fossil energies in a sustainable way. Yes. So this has also a strategic component. Yes? So why should actually, so to say, Europe or the United States or other democracies basically import fossil energies from autocracies or dictatorships in the world just because they basically can offer this in a cheap way? Yes. So I think here basically should be also a little bit the self-critical thinking. Yes? So we could say without this spiking in prices now for natural gas or petroleum, is what would be the willingness, so to say, within Europe really to take this ecological green transition seriously? Yes. And so this may be one of the very few, so to say, factors which may have, hopefully, so to say, a positive impact.
All right. But, right now it seems like a very complicated process of, like finding like these alternatives.
Mhm.
So, like just in order to survive this winter, what do you think, what would be the best alternative to use for heating in Europe? Professor Sterio? Where should we get those supplies from?
I mean, that is really the $1 million question. I think in order to cut off all of Russian supplies of energy sources, the EU would have to turn to the Middle East. Essentially compete with the US, if you will, for some of those markets. But as as the autumn and winter approaches, I think those are going to become very difficult conversations, and as I mentioned earlier, that's not something you can accomplish in a day or two. That takes planning, that takes strategy, and so it might be that because of that, Europe is sort of stuck, if you will, in the near term, in a sense that it might have to still rely on some of these Russian sources.
So basically, like we've heard actually from the Middle East countries saying they're not going to be able to supply most of Europe, like with the amount of gas and oil they have in their reserves. So basically, we're still going to be seeing a lot of Russian oil and Russian gas, but extremely high prices. Do you think that many countries are actually going to be able to afford that?
Yeah, and that's the problem, and that goes back to your beginning question about shortcomings, if you will, in EU policies, and so that gets to this issue of long-term policy. It's one thing to, in the short term, say, you Russia, you're evil, we're going to sanction you, we're going to cut off buying oil from you in the short term, but then you have to think of those long-term issues and long-term solutions, and so what you're talking about, this basically will expose the fractures, if you will, within the EU, because some countries are not going to be able to afford those high prices. And so some EU countries are going to have to start saying, look, we have to do business with Russia because we have no other alternatives. And, if prices remain so high, they might say, well, you know what, these other sanctions, we have to kind of loosen them up. We have to, Russia has to continue to be a trading partner for us, and so I do think that in terms of these shortcomings, I think EU has to turn towards looking for these longer term solutions, longer term planning in terms of energy, in terms of membership in the EU, in terms of the economy, if you will, on a larger scale.
It really poses a question about sanctions. Do they actually work against Russia? Because we've seen that many countries are now opting to pay in rubles. And it's one of the conditions that Russia has, set up to basically get the gas like running from the country and get more money and more finances to finance the war in Ukraine. So, do you think that the sanctions that are imposed against Russia are they actually working?
Yeah, I'm a skeptic. I'll be very brief. I'm a skeptic when it comes to sanctions. There's obviously, first of all, there's a big, human rights, human well-being issue related to sanctions in the sense that oftentimes you have the population of the targeted country that actually ends up suffering the most. It's not Putin and his close allies that are suffering. It's the regular Russian who's suffering, who really actually might not support Putin at all, might have nothing to do with the Russian, policy. And then you have to think of the effectiveness of sanctions on a global scale. And I really don't see, as of now, I don't see a huge deterrent effect that sanctions might be having. Now that is a topic that's open for debate, and I know that others might disagree with me on this, but I don't see them as being super effective without them being coupled with other things. So if you have sanctions that are working in tandem with other responses, perhaps a military response, perhaps a UN response or a NATO response, then maybe they're effective. But I think sanctions in isolation are not necessarily the best foreign policy tool.
Professor Campbell, do you think that sanctions are working against Russia?
In a certain sense, probably this is a belief question. Is so in 5 to 10 or 15 years, we may know in a scientific way. We can, in that sense, have done our nice models. And so we are now standing at the beginning. Yes, I know there's always a controversy also in that sense in academic communities. Now, I would say the problem is if you do not impose sanctions, what in that sense are the alternatives? Yes, so I think it's clear you just cannot allow in that sense, so to say, the Putin Russia to invade a neighboring country without any reactions. Yes, I think there is, in a certain sense, a consensus. Nobody wants to have a third world war. So that's to avoid something like a direct Russia-NATO a military confrontation. And I think gradually these sanctions will have their effects, and in that sense, they're going to work. Yes. Now, if I want to look for examples, I think one of the best examples where sanctions also worked in the past was in bringing politically down the apartheid regime in South Africa. Yes. In a I don't know, in a military sense or whatsoever, this was a well-equipped regime, which maybe could have continued for a long time, but basically the sanctions had, so to say, dried out the apartheid regime, yes, and in that sense, brought it to a fall. But again, I think we should always very carefully monitor the sanctions, and in that sense, well, how can I make sure to also hit in that sense, so to say, this elite, this oligarchic elite is, which has profited from the regime. And now the one thing being debated, of course, also controversially and differently in different member countries of the European Union, is, so to say, to ban or to stop issuing tourist visa for Russian citizens. Yes, because then this, of course, would have the implication for the Russian rich. Well, then they could not go on. I mean, in that sense, the Russian rich still probably, if they get an issue, can go on vacation to, I don't know, to Paris or Monaco or whatever nice destinations you have in Europe. So you fly via Serbia or Turkey, whatsoever. And if they don't get the visa, as somebody said, well, then they can have spent the vacation in Peking or Pyongyang or something like this. Yes, because then this also would mean, well, then the oligarch, he or she as a person cannot enter the yacht or the villa, whatever, so to say, these financial constructions were. Yes. But I mean, the sad part, of course, is in that sense. I mean, Russia, in that sense, has earned all this money with its fossil energies over years and decades. These, so to say, financial resources should have been used for
I think we have some technical
building
difficulties. Professor Campbell, can you hear me? So we're just gonna leave it there. Like now, I just want to focus on something else, and
up
it's
an economy and for building up a democracy. Yes.
Okay, Professor Campbell. Unfortunately, we had some technical issues, and we couldn't hear your last answer. But let's just move on. I just want to focus on
Yes,
something
yes.
else right now, and it's Russia seems the war in Ukraine as a special operation, and we've been hearing reports that it might be changing and stepping up their
Mhm,
game and pronounce it as a war, state of war.
mhm,
So my question is, will that change the dynamics on the ground that we're seeing in Ukraine? Professor
mhm.
Sterio, what do you think?
So if Russia were to change its tactics and treat this as a war, I don't necessarily. I mean, unless the Russian military tactics on the ground changed significantly, and I'm talking about concrete military actions on the ground, unless they change significantly, I don't think that the Ukrainian response would necessarily change as much. But if the Russian rhetoric changes, it would change legal issues, if you will, associated with the war. So if Russia claimed that it was in an international armed conflict, then all of a sudden, instruments of international humanitarian law would become clearly applicable. Most of us think that they already are applicable, but if for Russia itself, it could no longer claim that these treaties and conventions and customary law do not apply because it's somehow not an international war. So in some ways, if Russia officially declared that it's somehow an international war, this could actually legally backfire for Russia. So it's a slightly, dangerous strategy for Russia. But I think on the ground, I'm not sure that it significantly changes things unless the Russian military tactics themselves on the ground change significantly.
Professor Campbell, so what do you
Mhm,
think if the special operation turns into a full-scale war, in the legal term? So do you think
mhm.
that Russia's going to act differently, and how the EU is going to respond to it? Does it mean more
Well,
weapons?
this
Does
is
it mean
yes. This, of course, would be a very worrisome scenario. Now, the something in between ours would be, well, what would be the implications, let's say, if Russia would start to use so-called weapons of mass destruction within the war in Ukraine, going even as far as using nuclear weapons, whatever type, so to say, yes? So I do not think the main issue here at the moment, in an intended way, would be a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. But what is, in that sense, if there would be an application of weapons of mass destruction is. And then in that sense, how should the West react or not react, etc. Now, in terms of the special operation, I think it's somehow obvious that Putin cannot win war in Ukraine. Yes, maybe it can go into a stalemate. Yes, I mean, so to say, in that frame, it is thinkable that this war could continue for years and years. I mean, we have the very tragic, so to say, experience of the civil war in the Balkans, which went on for years and years and years. So, and in that sense, of course, if the war would continue as it is also a major drag.
I'm afraid we're still experiencing some technical issues with Professor Campbell. So I
This
just want to move on, and basically we reached my final question here, and I want to know with Professor Sterio, if you can tell me what might the EU look like 5 or maybe 7 years after the war in Ukraine?
now we have,
Professor
I
Campbell, unfortunately, we had some
think
technical issue with
this
you.
was yesterday,
I don't know if you can hear me.
in
Yes, we have some issues with Professor Campbell.
Moscow.
Professor Campbell, unfortunately, we had some issues with your connection there. So we'll just move on with the question. Professor Sterio, so what do you think what the EU might look like 5 or 7 years after Russia's war in Ukraine?
Yeah, that's also an excellent question, and we briefly talked about this at the beginning of this hour. So right now, when it comes to EU membership, even before the Ukraine crisis, there were definitely tensions because there were several countries that had been seeking to become EU members, and we saw this lack of willingness on behalf of existing EU members to enlarge the union. So countries in the Balkans, such as Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Albania, but then also Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. Those are all countries that had been seeking EU membership. And then at the start of the Ukrainian crisis, we saw renewed calls from Ukrainian President Zelensky to basically become, for Ukraine to become a full-fledged EU member. And so now the Ukraine crisis has brought these issues even more to the forefront of the EU. So, should the EU become enlarged? Should it absorb, accept all of these new member states? Unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic that the EU will be significantly enlarged 5 or 6 or 7 years from now. I think that the reluctance from the existing EU members to have that type of enlargement will remain in place, especially because even if places like Ukraine do become members of the EU, as we've discussed previously, that wouldn't necessarily change the sort of defense strategy or military response directly, and it would just expose EU countries to more significant economic pressures. And in light of the worsening economic situation in Europe, caused by the Russian aggression against Ukraine, I just predict more of a backlash, if you will, from existing EU members to allow for enlargement. And so my prediction, and I could be wrong, but my prediction is that the EU will not be significantly enlarged over the next 5 to 7 years, and that instead the EU might consider creating, cooperation agreements or alliances with countries such as Ukraine and some of these other countries that are mentioned, which would allow the EU to continue to assist these countries, but would not allow for full membership.
Great. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time and your insight. We heard really interesting things about the ongoing crisis in the European Union. And unfortunately, we don't have Professor Campbell to wrap up this conversation. But I just want to say thank you one more time for being with us. And for our listeners, thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.